Hey everyone, welcome to Community of Grace Lutheran Church here on Facebook and YouTube. My name is Tim Wright. We're coming to you from our campus here in Peoria, Arizona. This is what they call in the business Take 3. So we're hoping three's a charm as we bring the service to you today. So glad to have you joining us. We're in a series right now, part 3 of a series called Not Your Parents or Not Your Grandparents Sunday School Stories. And what we're doing is we're looking at some of these iconic stories, particularly from the first book of the Bible, Genesis, that many of us heard when we were growing up. We heard them in Sunday school. But then when we got a little older, we found out that these stories aren't quite the way we thought they were. They weren't quite taught the way that we read them. And so we see some things that raise some questions. Sometimes the stories seem a little darker. And so we're looking at these stories. We're trying to wipe away, peel away some of the confusion, because these are really subversive stories about God who is radically different than we can imagine. So let me give you an example. We're going to be looking at a story today called Noah and the Ark. This is the Sunday school version. All right, you can see everybody's happy, everything is okay, we made it on the boat. This is what the story looks like when you read it in the Bible. And particularly if you read it literally as a historic account of something that happened thousands of years ago. But neither one of those interpretations of the story of Noah is actually correct. It's not really in line with what the storyteller had in mind. And so today we're going to try to look at it from the storyteller's perspective and from the perspective of the people who heard that story thousands of years ago. So what I'd like you to do is something you did last week. Use your imagination. You are sitting out in a field. It's nighttime. It's dark. You and your villagers, your fellow tribesmen and women are there. You're sitting in semicircles around this bonfire. And sitting between you and the bonfire is the storyteller, back again for story time. But this week, rather than telling a story, he asks a question. Are there some things that you'd like to talk about? And everybody looks at you because they know that you're not going to sit still if you can't ask your questions. And so the storyteller nods to you, and you ask your question. It's an ancient question. Probably one of the first questions that human beings asked, at least religious human beings. And the question is this: why this God? Why do we worship this God? Why do we follow this God? What makes this God unique? Why do we worship this God and not the gods of our neighbors? Now here we are in 2023, thousands of years later, and we're still asking similar kinds of questions. As Christian people, we ask, why Jesus? What makes Christianity unique? Why do we follow Jesus rather than Muhammad or Buddha? Or maybe some people who aren't into religion at all might look at all these different religions and ask the question, don't they all lead to the same God? Aren't you worshiping the same God? So these are really ancient questions that we still ask to this day. Now, when this particular story was told, the people of Israel were trying to get their brains around their identity. Their identity as a people, and their identity as a religious movement, because they believed that they were the chosen people, that God had chosen them. Their identity was rooted in God. And so it was natural for them to ask the question, who is this God? What is this God like? Particularly because the gods of their neighbors could be seen. The sun god, the moon god, idols. The God of the people of Israel, you couldn't see that God. And sometimes the other gods seemed a lot stronger than your God. So why this God? Now the storyteller, rather than giving a philosophical existential treatise on the nature of God, tells a story. And the genius of this particular story is that he borrows one from the surrounding cultures. He borrows a story about their gods and retells it through the lens of the God of Israel, to show in subtle and not so subtle ways why this God is so radically different and why they follow this God. It is a subversive story that turns upside down everything everybody believes about gods. So what he tells here is a flood story. Again, he's borrowing it from the surrounding culture. It's an ancient story. And what's important to keep in mind are a couple things. First of all, the people back then had no concept of a world. For them, the world was where they lived, the land that they owned, maybe the surrounding land around their land. And so if a flood came through and wiped out everything, wiped out their village, wiped out their crops, wiped out their homes, it would be a universal flood. It wiped out their world. Secondly, they didn't understand how nature worked back then. They didn't understand the science of nature. So for them, anything that happened at the hands of the gods. The sun shines because the gods make it shine. The rain falls because the gods make it fall. The Diamondbacks win because the gods make them win. And so everything that happened was blamed on God or the gods. That's their mindset. But in 2023, we're not much different. There's still a lot of things that, even in a science-based world, we still ascribe to God. For example, we have storms that blow through, and we sometimes call those acts of God. Or maybe somebody's going through a tough time, a devastating time, and they might ask the question, why has God abandoned me? Or why is God punishing me? Or people might look at the world and see all of the suffering and all of the heartache and the pain and ask the question, how can you believe in a God who allows such suffering? And so even to this day, we sometimes filter things that are happening, especially bad things, through God, that somehow God is behind it. That's the context of this story. And so this is an ancient story, borrowed from other cultures about their gods, reinterpreted through the lens of the God of Israel, speaking to an ancient people, an ancient mindset, and yet looking at universal questions that are timeless, questions we're still asking today. So in the book of Genesis, the flood has been building for 6 chapters. Genesis starts out in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, talking about the Spirit of God hovering over the chaos and over the void. And this God begins to speak. He speaks order into the chaos. He puts a boundary between the darkness and the light. He puts a boundary between the water on the earth and then the waters in the sky, meaning the rain. He puts a boundary between the land and the seas. This is a God who brings order and harmony and peace out of chaos, and everything that God creates is good. But by the time we get to Genesis 6, all of that good order that God has put in place has been disrupted by chaos. Chaos that human beings unleashed, a flood of chaos that human beings unleashed when we decided to try to go it on our own. We saw that last week in our story of Adam and Eve, this metaphorical theological story about 2 people representing humanity and our tendency to choose our own wisdom over God's wisdom, to choose our way over God's way, and we get lost. And when we get lost, we unleash this flood of brokenness and pain and hurt into the world. So by the time we get to Genesis 6, the world has been overwhelmed by this flood of chaos, and here's how the storyteller puts it. He says, the Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. What God created is good. What God saw is good in Genesis chapter 1. God now sees as chaos and brokenness and evil. And it's here that we begin to see some of the subtle differences. In the original story, the story that the storyteller is borrowing, the gods decide to wipe out the earth because human beings were making too much noise. And the noise pollution irritated them. And because they're irritated and angry at all the noise human beings are making, they wipe them out. This God is different. This God is not irritated at human noise. This God is not angry at the rock and roll music coming from his neighbor's house. He's not a grumpy neighbor. This is a God whose heart has been wounded because the creation that he loves has broken itself. And it's unleashed pain onto them, which brings pain to the heart of God. Philip Yancey, in his book, What's So Amazing About Grace, shares a story that a pastor friend related to him. This pastor and his wife had a 15-year-old daughter who was extremely rebellious, getting herself into all kinds of trouble. She'd blame her parents for all of it, and she would stay out half the night, and one particular night she didn't come home at all. And so as the pastor was telling the story, here's what he said to Philip Yancey. I remember standing before the plate glass window. I was in my living room. staring out into the darkness, waiting for her to come home. I felt such rage. I wanted to be like the father of the prodigal son, yet I was furious with my daughter for the way she would manipulate us and twist the knife to hurt us. And of course, she was hurting herself more than anyone. I understood then the passages in the prophets expressing God's anger. The people knew how to wound him, and God cried out in pain. And yet I must tell you, when my daughter came home that night, or rather the next morning, I wanted nothing in the world so much as to take her into my arms, to love her, to tell her I wanted the best for her. I was a helpless, lovesick father. That's what's happening in this story. The story of Noah and the ark, the story of the flood, is the story of a wounded God, a heart-sick father, and how this wounded, pain-filled God responds to the chaos, the flood of pain and brokenness that his creation has unleashed unto itself. And it's here that we see the major difference between the God of Israel and the other gods. In the original story, the other gods just wipe their hands of all humanity. They leave humanity to their own devices to destroy themselves, but not this God. This God, out of love and compassion, moves into the flood of chaos with a rescue plan. He chooses a family, Noah, who becomes the great ancestor of Abraham, who is called by God to be the father of the Jewish people, the chosen people, through whom God will bless the world, and that finds its culmination in the ancestor of Noah and Jesus, or Noah and Abraham, and it's Jesus, who experiences the full force of the chaos that we've unleashed in the world. He takes it all onto himself through his death and resurrection, so that Jesus can reconcile the world to himself. He can begin to bring order where we've brought chaos, and does that through grace and mercy, compassion and forgiveness. This is not a story of an angry God who vents his fury onto the world by destroying it. This is a story of a God whose heart has been broken because his creation has wandered from him and unleashed all kinds of pain onto itself. And this God acts out of love and grace by calling a family, by implementing a rescue plan that culminates in the death and resurrection of Jesus, who puts all things together. And so this is a global story. This is about a God who wants to rescue all of creation and does so through Jesus. And it's a personal story, because this God comes to you in the flood of the chaos that you experience and makes this promise to you. Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I called you by name, you are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. For I am the Lord your God. Amen.